所以啊，我刚才下载了一些，有的可以先我们学校是把中国指导里边的社会的基本都买了。要说你对文化倾向的吗？你先看那些影像，真的看法的是你要看那个，我做事录，其实它不要其他的话，不过这个是看电影，对啊，其实很多我少觉得中国电影来说是比较少。
Hello everyone. Okay, welcome to 交通大学. Okay, and welcome to join the first wave of winter cold front today with us, and to welcome Professor Jason Lim from Australia. Okay, and Professor Jason Lim, I've met him in Singapore. Right, we're both doing postdoc together at the same time in the University of Singapore. And after that, he has gone to Australia, again back to Australia, because he received his PhD education in the University of Western Australia. And then after a postdoc back in Singapore, he went back to Australia, and then he's now a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong at the Department of Asian History. Okay, that's right. Okay, so Professor Lim has published widely regarding Singapore and also the trans-regional trade and networks between Taiwan and Southeast Asia. Okay. So his first book, which is a revision of his dissertation, is published in 2010. It's called Linking an Asian Trans-Regional Commerce in Tea, Overseas Chinese Merchants in the Fujian-Singapore Trade, 1920 to 1960. Okay, so it's directly related to Taiwan and Fujian and Singapore. And then his second book, published in 2013, is called A Slow Ride into the Past, the Chinese Tree Straw Industry in Singapore, 1942 to 1983. Okay, so it's a book about Singapore, okay, social history. So Professor Jason Lim has embarked on his new research project for already a couple of years, and it's about the economic and cultural diplomacy with regards to the ROC in relation to East and Southeast Asia during the Cold War. Okay, so with this new project, he has kindly agreed to give us 2 talks at NCTU in this room. So today is the first talk entitled Understanding Taiwan-Southeast Asian Relations During the Cold War. So it will be a broad introduction of this project and also specifically in relation to the archives in Taiwan. Okay. And tomorrow in my class, in my seminar on ethnographies of Southeast Asia, Professor Lim will give another talk which is about the Singapore, right? The Singapore history in Cold War. So everyone in this room is also invited to join us tomorrow afternoon from 1:30 to 4:30 in the same room. Okay, so without further ado, let's welcome Professor Jason Lim.
Okay, thank you very much. I just hope this works. Thank you very much for inviting me to 交通大学 to give this talk. And as Yan mentioned, I'll be speaking over 2 days on largely the Cold War in East and Southeast Asia. And as in the introduction, as she had mentioned in the introduction, my original research was on overseas Chinese business history. So I was at that point looking at the tea trade between Fujian and Singapore, and as a result of that research project, I inevitably had to look at that trade after 1949. So basically, once the communists proclaimed the People's Republic in 1949, whatever happened to the Fujian Singapore tea trade, and it was of course at the onset of the Cold War, so there was also Taiwanese merchants who came in to sell their tea, which I'll talk a little bit later on. And that, in a sense, then sort of led to the project that I'm doing now, which is basically looking at the relationship that Taiwan had with Southeast Asia during the Cold War. Specifically during the period when Jiang Jiechi was the president, and a little bit on Jiang Jingguo, but that is going to be a very long period, so I'm only looking at the first few decades, first few years. I'm just curious, are there any historians in this room? Great, so if I said a lot of funny things, nobody is going to ask me anything. No, the reason why I'm doing this, I asked that question is because if you're a historian, you're going to go like, oh God, what is he going to talk about these archives? Because you'll be so used to all the documents and everything, and the reading of the documents and trying to understand that. So I'm glad actually there are no historians in this room. So I'll just start. Whoa. Just press one button and suddenly like 7 slides.
And how many?
63. And it's, I'm not sure why it's okay, this is the second one, okay. Yeah, I numbered it there so I can tell, otherwise I'll be really confused. Now, it's a good thing that I'm doing this project also, because in the last few years I've discovered that suddenly there's been a very big interest in what was going on during the Cold War. Cold War studies, or what some researchers call new Cold War studies, as scholarship emerged not long after the end of the Cold War in 1991. Now, as interest grew, research institutes on the Cold War emerged, while existing ones added Cold War studies into their range of research interests. Now, my own opinion is that any suggestion that the Cold War has ended is really taking on a Eurocentric or Western-centric view, largely because the defining moments that marked the supposed end of the Cold War are what I would call the 3 collapses. One is the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The second one is the fall of the communist governments in Eastern Europe from 1989 to 1990. And the third one is the eventual end of the Soviet Union in 1991. So obviously especially I remember in 1991, I was, for those of you who are Taiwanese, you probably have gone through national service. In 1991, I was a national service corporal running around with a rifle. So when people say the Cold War ended, I was like, oh great, what am I doing here? But the thing is, now, as I look back, when people talk about the Cold War ending in 1991, I just can't help but think that it's really looking at it from a very Eurocentric point of view, because nothing in East and Southeast Asia has suggested the Cold War has ended. I mean, you still have the People's Republic of China around, and the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989 shows the resolve by the Chinese Communist Party to crush all dissent. The continuing Cold War in Asia can be seen in how the PRC, or China, treats Taiwan and Southeast Asia. So in response, the Taiwanese government since the 1990s had embarked on a new southbound policy to link Taiwan with Southeast Asia, and even all the way to Australia and India. And this was a joke when I came here last year on a Taiwan fellowship with the National Library in Taipei. And someone was giving a talk about Antarctica and how maybe there might be some interest that the Taiwanese government might have on Antarctica. And someone said, wow, your new southbound policy now goes all the way to Antarctica. But the thing is, a large part of this diplomatic initiative for the new southbound policy is about economic relations, cultural exchanges, and it actually is not really anything new, because when we look at what happened from the 1950s to 1975 when President Jiang Jiesu died, this was going on between Taiwan and Southeast Asia anyway. So today I plan to go back a little bit in time to look at that relationship Taiwan had with Southeast Asia through the use of a selection of archival records held in Taiwan. So the four of them are listed up there. So basically the 国史馆、档案管理局、中央研究院近代史研究所档案馆 and the 国民党. I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's such a mouthful. But basically the 国民党党史馆. So all these places, they keep records about the Taiwanese, essentially the Taiwanese government. And in the case of Kuomintang, although it's a party archives, from 1949 to 1975, as we know, the Kuomintang was the government. So you do have reports down there monitoring situation in Southeast Asia and what kind of response the government should make when some crisis happens somewhere in Southeast Asia. What initiative could the government introduce to try to cultivate diplomatic ties with specific Southeast Asian countries. Now this, for my presentation today, it's going to be supplemented by a collection of materials in Australia and Singapore, because I've collected quite a little bit of items from those places. So the aim of the presentation is to show that Taiwan was a key player during the Cold War through Taiwan's use of cultural and economic diplomacy in Southeast Asia, in addition to military and political assistance. So that in effect was the Cold War situation at that time. Tomorrow I hope they'll be able to zoom in on the relationship Taiwan had with one particular country in Singapore and in Southeast Asia, and that's Singapore, during the time period from 1949 to 1990, in order to understand the relationship between the two countries. So as Yin Ling mentioned, I am from Singapore. Before I did my PhD, I worked in National Archives of Singapore, so I'm very familiar with keeping of documents and the dissemination of records, and I can understand when sometimes I approach, for instance, the 国史馆 and I wanted a file and they said 暂不开放. Okay, alright, so fair enough, I'm not going to complain. But there's a reason why there's nothing really secretive. Usually archival institutions, they have a certain period of time when records will not be released because it's considered too recent. So I'm not sure about Taiwan, but I believe it's the same as Singapore, and that's 30 years. So now it's 2018. If you're looking for any record that is 1989 or 1990, you will not get it because of the embargo. So in a way, it's fortunate because if I'm looking at President Jiang Jieshi, he died in 1975. The records I want should be released, but surprisingly, there are a few that are not released. Okay, the first point I have there is probably a contentious one outside Taiwan, and that is the name of the country that we are standing on. I cannot remember. I just happened to hear it fleetingly this morning. I think in one of the TV channels, there was a baker or something like that who said that he's from Zhongguo, Taiwan. And then there's this big hoo-ha about why did he call it Zhongguo, Taiwan, and that kind of thing. Now, in the archival records held in Taiwan, the name that's used is always Republic of China, right? 中华民国. And for English documents, it will be the ROC. Naturally, when it comes to the relationship that Taiwan has with Southeast Asia, is officially a Chinese relationship. So like Sino-Vietnamese relationship, 中越关系, 中马关系, 中新两国, that kind of thing. I will not go into details about Jiang Jieshi and the position of ROC as a legal entity because I think you know about this aspect of history better than I do. But governments outside Taiwan use very different names, and you'll find it when you look at archival records in Australia, Singapore, Malaysia. I even seen some in Hong Kong. So the options, I really mean options, are up there. Nationalist China, Free China, Taiwan, Formosa, which is I thought was really odd, but you do see Formosa. You use sometimes Taipei, sometimes the KMT government, sometimes the Chiang Kai-shek Authority, sometimes the Kuomintang regime, and so on and so forth. And the reason why is because after 1949, the word China is avoided when it comes to Taiwan, because it increasingly refers to the PRC. In newspapers in Singapore, for instance, looking at the newspapers published in, say, the 1950s and 1960s, in the 50s you might still see 中华民国, but in the 1960s you will see Taiwan. Then sometimes by the 1970s, in the 60s you might even see 自由中国. By the 1970s it's definitely Taiwan, and that has remained largely unchanged. So overseas governments and newspapers seem to work tirelessly, and I really mean tirelessly, to ensure that there has to be a distinction between China, which is now considered PRC, and Taiwan. So I'm going to use the name Taiwan for this presentation because I am in Taiwan, and I'm talking about essentially what was going on between Taiwan and Southeast Asia. Now, when it comes to the Cold War in East and Southeast Asia, Taiwan seems to be on the periphery of recent scholarship. Questions on Taiwan during the Cold War places it within the strategic and military network of the United States containment policy against the spread of communism out of China. Recent publications also look at how domestic politics of Taiwan reflected the suspicion, I might even say paranoia, of the Kuomintang government on the island. So, Paisa Kongpo, this will probably be familiar with it. So, the Kuomintang promoted Taiwan as a bastion of freedom against communist dictatorship. The reality, of course, as we know, is that the Kuomintang exerted a very strong control of local politics in Taiwan. The period from 1949 to 1988 was largely one of the White Terror because Taiwan was under martial law until 1987. The Kuomintang also considered Taiwan to be what they call a cultural repository of all things Chinese. whether it's language, history, culture, or traditions, and anything Chinese would be promoted from museums to schools. This is an important factor because the Kuomintang continued to court the loyalty of the overseas Chinese, the point there, in order to steer them away from China at a time when the decolonization movement in Southeast Asia was in full swing. So you have all these Chinese people in Southeast Asia. Citizenship was denied them by the new countries during the decolonization process. Again, this is really going into Southeast Asian history from 1945 to around 1965. One by one, many of the Southeast Asian colonies became independent. And then as they became independent, you now have local people taking charge of government affairs. But in those countries, there are maybe significant numbers of Chinese people. They may be born in those countries. What are we going to do with them? We want to deny them citizenship because they are not like us. You know, they're not Burmese, they're not Malay, they're not Indonesian, and so on. But at the same time, you know, these Chinese people were born in the country, right? So Indonesian Chinese, for example, born in Indonesia, what are we going to do with them if we deny them citizenship? So some of these Indonesian Chinese, for instance, they would side with China, some would side with Taiwan, and the Kuomintang government obviously wanted to court these Chinese people to make them feel that they do have a place in Taiwan. The other thing also is diplomatic relations. Right? Thailand was never colonized. It's a unique case where Thailand is the only country in Southeast Asia never to have been colonized. It established diplomatic relations with the Republic of China in 1945, followed by the Republic of the Philippines in 1948. After 1949, the Kuomintang government also opened embassies in Laos in 1953 and South Vietnam in 1955. However, both Burma and Indonesia recognized the PRC in 1950. It meant that when Indonesian President Sukarno, this was in 1955, he organized a conference in Bandung. Some of you may have heard of Bandung Conference. And President Sukarno is a very colorful character. He wanted a conference to gather all the newly independent countries in order to have some sort of an agenda or meeting that would exclude all the Western powers. And he organized that in 1955. And on the sidelines of that conference, the PRC and Indonesia signed a treaty that basically addressed the citizenship of Indonesian Chinese people. The message was that the Indonesian Chinese could take up Indonesian citizenship if they wanted to. It's not a problem. If they wanted to go back to China, there will be some provisions made for them to do so. But the message behind this treaty for some of the overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia was that China had turned its back on its overseas Chinese, largely because China wanted to cultivate good relationships with Southeast Asian countries, right? So that's one quandary that the Chinese in Indonesia would have to face. But Taiwan continued to, or the ROC continued to promote itself as a true representative of the overseas Chinese, largely because the Chinese national law of 1928 had proclaimed anyone who could trace their heritage to China as overseas Chinese, and automatically they will be citizens of the ROC. So after 1949, the government in Taipei continued to promote the ROC or Taiwan to overseas Chinese through the Overseas Chinese Affairs Commission, Chao Wei Hui. They had been founded in 1929. Now, the thing about Cold War in Southeast Asia, it's nearly always about the Vietnam War. Okay, until the 1990s, there was actually not much scholarship going on about the Cold War in Southeast Asia, largely because researchers, especially researchers based in American institutions, they only know Vietnam. Right? To them, Vietnam was anything and everything. We must win the battle against communism. And some of you may have heard of domino theory. The idea was that if one country were to fall to communism, its neighbor will also fall to communism, and so on and so on and so forth. John F. Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy, he actually, I think there was he gave an interview to a reporter, and he said that, if we don't stop what's going on in Vietnam, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Malaya will grow. So in other words, all these countries will suddenly become communist. Lyndon Johnson, his successor, went even further and suggested that in order to stop Vietnam, we have to crush the communist movement. So he started to send lots of troops, American troops, over to Vietnam, and that's really the story of the Vietnam War. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that for many of us, and I grew up in the Cold War, so this is maybe quite a scary part. The Vietnam War is a bit far away. I mean, Vietnam is far closer to Singapore and Malaya than say the US, but it seems like a very far away thing because we have our own challenges within our countries. Now, in Cold Wars, these are correct. Well, what I meant to say in this slide was that if you hold on to the idea that coming back to the point I made earlier that most of the scholarship on the Cold War is about the Vietnam War, this document would have been useful because it's, maybe I should write down where I took this document from. I was preparing and obviously forgot about it. It's probably Guoshiguan. And it's really just an article typeset, type verbatim from a newspaper, the Chicago Tribune. It's up there in small words, Chicago Tribune, December 30th. And it's basically saying that the South Vietnamese president, Ngo Dinh Diem, wanted nationalist Chinese forces in Vietnam. So he wanted ROC troops to come and help him fight alongside the Americans and the South Vietnamese army against the communists. And I'm not sure whether it's. I should have taken this out earlier. Whoops, yeah. Yeah, and I forgot it out. Over here, right, it says right now President Chiang Kai-shek's 600,000 men was provide a major deterrent to communist expansion. And then it goes on to say that, you see up here, somewhere there, this small beleaguered young republic, South Vietnam, is one of the few countries in Southeast Asia which unhesitatingly welcomes the support of nationalist Chinese forces on Formosa. Again, it's one of those terms, in a Cold War against the communists of mainland China. So the way it's structured, of course, is that if we were to fight alongside South Vietnam, we will push back the North Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese communist regime and the Chinese communist regime will eventually collapse. Nobody seriously believed that would happen, but it's a very strong ideal that many policymakers in South Vietnam and especially the United States, even the United Kingdom had. Now in Cold War studies that are focused on Taiwan, there's research work on the military threat from China itself. So Michael Sony's book Cold War Island, that's the one on the left, comes to mind. He had looked at how the small island of Jinmen was militarized to become an outpost for the Taiwanese military, as the island came under constant bombardment from the mainland. He traced defeats from the defeat of the PLA, People's Liberation Army, in Jinmen, to the impact the constant bombardment had on the lives of people living on the island. Another work on the recollections of the experiences of members of what was then called the Republic of China Military Advisory Group in Vietnam, was published as 西贡往事知多少, And I'm sorry, the image is a bit blurry because I had to take it off, I think, one of those online bookshops, and because I couldn't find a copy of the book. In 2000. This book was published in 2000. Writing in 1990, there's a researcher, Yi San Wang, I don't have the Chinese characters, so I could mispronounce this person's name, noted that the majority of its, as in Taiwan's East Asian neighbors, were anti-communist in their foreign policies and demonstrated their sympathy towards Taipei by supporting the ROC's international position. That international position was its standing on world anti-communism. Now, this one, there have been increasing studies on the impact of the Cold War in Southeast Asia in the last decade, and I could use these two examples because I was there when these two, I was in National University of Singapore as a postdoc when these two books were being prepared. So there was an international conference in November 2009 called the Cold War in Southeast Asia, Origins, Development and Impact. Now the reason why this conference was organized was because 2009 marked the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Albert Lau, the editor of the book on the left, actually told me that he felt it's really strange that everyone's talking about Cold War and they're talking about the end of the Berlin Wall as if that was it. But what happened in Southeast Asia during that time? So he was the convener of that conference, and he published the proceedings of the conference as Southeast Asia and the Cold War in 2012. Now in that same year, 2012, Malcolm Murphy, another associate professor of history at the National University of Singapore, published Cold War Southeast Asia, that's the book on the right. This is actually a series of public lectures that the National University of Singapore organized, where the Department of History lecturers would talk about how the Cold War had an impact on each Southeast Asian country. So it went on for about 6 or 8 weeks. So 1 week there will be on Vietnam, 1 week on Laos, and so on. And what Malcolm did was to put them all together into this book. Early this year, Professor Ang Cheng Guan from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore launched that book, his latest book, which is the one on the left, Southeast Asia's Cold War and Interpretive History. Now there are other books published about Southeast Asia outside Singapore, but one area is noticeably missing, and that's the role of Taiwan. If you look at any of these books that I just mentioned, Taiwan is not in the picture at all. So it sort of adds on to the belief that Taiwan was really just on the periphery, that there wasn't really anything important about Taiwan. All you had to do was make sure that it doesn't fall into communist hands, and the Americans are somehow or other hanging around because of the war in Vietnam. There's a very detailed study by Chen Hong Yu, that's the guy, the book on the right, on the relationship between the Republic of China and Southeast Asia. Now this book actually is quite an important source when you want to look at Taiwan-Southeast Asia relations, largely because he gave very detailed accounts. So he would say things like, on this day, this president met Chiang Kai-shek, President Chiang Kai-shek, and they discussed this. On that day, this minister met that minister to discuss this. So you can actually have a chronology of events, and from there it then would help you look for the kind of documents that you might need for further study. Then there are these two books that I found only last year. So again, it's all about the Cold War, but it's really very heavily focused on China and the conflict in Vietnam. So on the book on the left, if I remember correctly, so this book, there are lots of chapters about Vietnam, from how the French couldn't defeat the Vietnamese communists to the war in Vietnam and so on and so forth. Now, as Southeast Asia was decolonized, Taiwan saw the need to cultivate good diplomatic relations with newly independent states. or at least ensure that they do not have diplomatic relations with the PRC. So you look at the one on the poster on the left, right? So it's like, it feeds onto the idea that communism is expanding. Where are we going to finally put an end to all that? And it's quite telling, that image, because all the arrows are pointing towards Southeast Asia. So it's like saying, Southeast Asia is going to be the battleground between communist and anti-communist forces, so it's time that we draw a line over there. And the one on the map is Southeast Asia in 1960. Each country had different responses to China, but I'll only be looking at certain countries today. Now, declassified government files held in Taiwanese archives reveal that Taipei kept a very close watch on developments in Malaya. It's over here, which became Malaysia in 1963. Malaya and Singapore in the 1950s were going through decolonization, so the Chiang Kai-shek government was very observant as to what's going on over there. So my talk tomorrow will be more about Taiwanese engagement with Singapore. Now it is largely through declassified archives held in Taiwan and other countries that can get a sense of how Taiwan saw its role in the decolonizing Southeast Asia during the Cold War. I'm still collecting documents, so this project remains largely a work in progress. Based on the declassified archives, it is clear that Taiwan was closely monitoring what was going on in Southeast Asia, including what was at that time called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. So, for those of you who are familiar with European affairs, you got North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In Southeast Asia, we had the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization that started in 1955. The joke about Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, called SEATO for short, was that only 2 countries in SEATO were from Southeast Asia. There were 7 countries, only 2, the Philippines and Thailand, were members of SEATO. The remaining 5 were Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Pakistan. And when I first saw the name, I thought, why Pakistan? And apparently it's because next to Burma is Bangladesh. Bangladesh at that time was East Pakistan. So because East Pakistan wanted to be in SEATO, so Pakistan got put in as well. But you look at it, it's an organization that supposedly defending Southeast Asia, but only 2 out of 7 countries were from the region. In terms of diplomacy, based on the archival materials I found here, Taiwan had mainly the following approaches towards Southeast Asia. One is cultural diplomacy. That's the international promotion of the knowledge of Taiwan's political, social, and cultural values. So here, as I mentioned earlier on, Taiwan saw itself as a repository for all things Chinese. So you want to promote that overseas. You want to tell the world just what country Taiwan is, or ROC is, and you use the resources that you have. So it could be education, tourism, museum exhibitions, whatever it is. You want to tell the world just what your country is all about. Then you have economic diplomacy, which, as I mentioned there, promotes the state's prosperity and, as occasion demands and opportunity permits, manipulates its foreign, commercial, and financial relations in support of its foreign policy. So in the case of economic diplomacy, what will happen is Taiwan will tell us, look, this is by the 1960s, we are prosperous, right? We are one of the 4 economic tigers in Asia. We want to tell the world just how we did it, and we try to promote, for instance, agricultural and scientific knowledge with other countries who are willing to learn from us. We will provide technical assistance. We will be involved in the industrialization projects in other countries, and we try to promote trade. So if you look at the nearest I can think of today now is really China's One Belt, One Road initiative. It's really economic diplomacy, right? You want to build a highway here, we can show you how it's done. We got the money, we will let you do the project as you wish. But in the 1950s, from the 1950s to the 1970s, Taiwan was basically involved in taking these two approaches when it comes to Southeast Asia. So the first approach I'll talk now is cultural diplomacy. Now, what is cultural diplomacy? Or rather, the details of cultural diplomacy. In a very recent issue of this journal called Australian Outlook, James Carey wrote that cultural diplomacy involves governmental programs that allow populations to interact with each other through cultural artifacts. These artifacts can reflect any aspect of the state's culture and can involve food, visual art, literature, cultural exchange programs, academic exchange, overseas student programs, and language classes, to name a few. So it's, like I mentioned earlier, it's really talking about what Taiwan can offer to the rest of the world in terms of cultural knowledge and education. So from Carey's perspective, cultural diplomacy is a form of soft power. Some of you may be familiar with the term. Soft power is a term that was coined by Professor Joseph Nye to describe the ability to influence the behavior of others to get the outcomes you want. So in other words, rather than tell people you better do exactly as I tell you, you now tell people, I'm not so bad. I can actually help you if you want to, but there will be conditions, right? If I help you do something, I expect something from you in return. So we're not going to talk about war. We're just going to talk about peaceful overtures to sort of help each other out. So there are various ways of promoting cultural diplomacy. It could be through education, entertainment industry, museums, publications, and so on. Right? Now it should be noted that when Professor Joseph Nye talked about soft power, he was talking about how soft power complements hard power. He wasn't thinking of how soft power would replace hard power. So from his point of view, soft power and hard power go together hand in hand. However, Taiwan was not able to introduce hard power to Southeast Asia because it faced its own military threats from the mainland. So obviously, Taiwan was in no position to threaten Southeast Asian states. Taiwan did play a minor role in the Korean and Vietnam wars, but it chose to win allies over in Southeast Asia through a system of economic, educational, and technical carrots. Right? So there's another article I read recently that was published in the International Journal of Cultural Policy. There were three authors. One is Dian Ang, who is a professor of cultural studies in the University of Western Sydney. And she argued that there's actually a distinction between cultural relations, which is, in her words, it grew naturally and organically without government intervention. In other words, it happened as it went along. And opposing that would be what she called cultural diplomacy, right, this term here, which is basically how diplomats try to engineer cultural relations between different countries. So really, the question then becomes, when we talk about cultural diplomacy, are we talking about how the government tried to promote Taiwan, or is it other people, non-government agencies, things that just happened as time went on, that Taiwan and, say, Malaysia or Singapore enjoyed a certain form of understanding among themselves, and therefore there was no government intervention. But in any case, it didn't matter, because when we look at Taiwan-Southeast Asia relations, there was some form of cultural diplomacy. And I'll come to that later on, because when we consider like Jingmajia, right, even the Golden Horse Awards, right, which was introduced to highlight the best in Taiwanese entertainment, that in a way is a form of soft power or cultural diplomacy from Taiwan. Now, in its anti-communist agenda, the Kuomintang government in Taiwan went one step further when it comes to its relations with South Vietnam. And I'll be basically looking at a few, obviously I can't look at all the Southeast Asian countries, so I'll be looking at a few. So South Vietnam is one. As cultural links with South Vietnam were forged, the Kuomintang government used culture and history as a backbone of that relationship that Taiwan has with South Vietnam. So one of those would be Confucianism. Right? Today we think of Confucianism, we think of very different things. But in the 1950s, Confucianism was used as a means to connect the peoples of Taiwan and South Vietnam, largely because of the common cultural links between the two countries. So Confucius was a philosopher from the spring and autumn period in Chinese history. It may be eons ago, but for some people his teachings reflected society that still held moral and cultural value, and therefore Confucianism should be preserved and even promoted as a cure for the country's ills. So as President Jiang Jieshi moved to counter the spread and influence of communism from China, Confucius became a focal point. China, Japan, South Korea, and South Vietnam all appeared, and I put appeared in quotation marks because it's really a very convenient term. They all appear to share a common Confucian heritage and legacy. Right. Historically, the Chinese script was also used in all these countries. The winning of hearts and minds was part of psychological warfare during the Cold War. It would be to the advantage of President Jiang Jieshi and the Kuomintang if people in East Asia recognize the legacy of Confucianism in their countries, and that Confucianism was incompatible with communism. Right? So that was the aim for President Jiang Jieshi. In a way, there has been, if I can go next here. Okay, through the promotion of Confucianism as the bedrock of East Asian culture, Taiwan hoped to be able to use this approach and strengthen educational, academic, and cultural ties with South Vietnam. So there's a historical linkage, right? Even today, when you look at Vietnamese history, they'll tell you that Vietnam was colonized 4 times by various Chinese empires. The last one was the Ming Dynasty. So there's obviously this very clear historical linkage. And both the old Chinese empires and Vietnam appeared to share a common cultural heritage through Confucius. After independence from Chinese rule in the 10th century, Vietnam continued to be a society steeped in Confucian values until the arrival of the French in the 19th century. Like the Chinese emperors, the Vietnamese emperors were also surrounded by scholars who were at the apex of society. Members of the scholar class were appointed into the bureaucracy after a long and grueling examination system. So Vietnam has something similar to the Chinese clergy, right? It's the same system. With the advent of colonialism, Vietnam went through a period of westernization. Now, this was when the French eventually started to make preparations to leave Vietnam. They fought a war with the Vietnamese communists, but that conflict was largely in the north. So it meant that because the war did not affect southern Vietnam, there was a revival of Confucianism in South Vietnam during that period from 1946 to 1954. So, for instance, a ceremony commemorating the birth of Confucius was organized in Hue, which is in central Vietnam, in 1953. Confucius' birthday on 28th of September was declared a national holiday as Teachers' Day by South Vietnam in 1953. So it follows Taiwan. In the spring of 1954, 15 prominent Confucianists in Vietnam organized an ancient studies society to study and promote Confucianism. So you can see a slow revival of Confucianism there. There was another conference in January 1955 that was organized by this Ancient Studies Society, and about 150 people turn up, including many overseas Chinese. So that becomes the focal point for Taiwan-Vietnam relations. Now, President Chiang Kai-shek and the South Vietnamese President Nguyen Diam, actually, in a sense, they do enjoy a certain close relationship. Both men faced, obviously, communist opponents in North Vietnam and China. Both men were very keen on resolving the conflict that was going on in Vietnam at the time. President Nguyen Diam was president of South Vietnam from 1955 to 1963, and both he and President Chiang Kai-shek worked together to promote cultural, economic, and military ties between both countries until President Nguyen Diam was assassinated in November 1963. He died a very violent death. Then there was a coup, and basically he was shot in very controversial circumstances. But in any case, he died in 1963. Both sides recognized their solidarity over anti-communism, and that solidarity over anti-communism was getting more and more important as the years went by, right? So it was a reasonable proposition for both Taiwan and South Vietnam to work together to create some form of East Asian cultural